All right, we are live. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time zone you're in. Thanks for joining us for this workshop this evening. Welcome to the tail end of MS Build, but it's not going to stop tonight. Everything is being recorded. These recordings will be available for you. Tonight, we are diving into Blazor WebAssembly. This is a technology that just went into general availability. I've been having a lot of fun with it. I'm super excited to share it with you. Before we get started, we do have a few prerequisites that are up on your screen. One of them is Microsoft Learn Profile. That's something that is pretty important because as you go through the modules, you can get little achievements like this. I'm not trying to brag or anything, just showing off one or two badges that I've gotten. This is my favorite one, going through an entire set of learning paths. So there's a ton of content there. Be sure to have your profile set up so that you can get those credits and those badges. We expect that you're familiar with C#. That's the language we're going to be using in .NET, that you're familiar with ASP.NET, and that you have some experience with VS Code, although we won't be going into more advanced features, so it should be fairly straightforward to follow along. If you can't get access to any of these from your device, that's perfectly okay. Again, this is recorded. All of these resources are available to come back to. This is an opportunity for me to show you how we walk through this and for you to ask questions. So let's go ahead and slide through. This is the session. If you look at that aka.ms link, that is where you can go to follow along. That is the link to the Learn module. Before I jump into that, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do today. So I'm going to welcome my team. I've got some moderators and production crew behind the scenes, making sure this goes smoothly. We're going to dive into the module, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time not only to answer your questions, but maybe to look at a few other cool projects. So that's the goal. I'm Jeremy Lickness. I'm a .NET program manager at Microsoft. I focus on .NET data. That's the entire data experience, although probably the best known data product we have is Entity Framework Core. So if you're doing anything with EF Core, I'm definitely the person to reach out to, but I'm also interested in any way that you interact with data. Now, if he's willing to step on, I've got a very special moderator, Daniel Roth, who has quite a bit of involvement with the Blazor team. Daniel, you want to share a little bit?
Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Roth. I'm a program manager on the Blazor team. It's great to be here. And Jeremy, I'm looking forward to what we're building tonight.
Yeah, no pressure, right? I have the person who led building the product watching me walk through it. So
we are here for you, Jeremy. You're going to be great.
Awesome. Thanks for helping out. Then we have the world famous John Galloway. John, welcome.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. I'm a big fan of Blazor since the beginning. I've helped teach some workshops and stuff, and I've had a front row seat because I help organize the .NET community stand-up. So I'm always working with Dan. Whenever they have big releases, we get him on the show, and he shows off all the stuff. And then lately, I've been looking at Blazor, especially with I've been working with the .NET development experience on Mac. And so we've been updating our tutorials and stuff, and we just shipped Blazor WebAssembly support with 8.6, which went out yesterday. So I'm excited.
Nice. Awesome. Great crew. And next up, we have Adrian.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, I'm Adrian Stevens. So I'm with the Microsoft Learn team. So that means I get to work with the talented folks that build the type of training content that we're going to look at today. And also, I came over, I'm a big Xamarin guy, so I'm a long-time C# lover, so I love tooling like Blazor. I'm a little humbled by the company here today, but I'm going to try to help out with some of the questions. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And then we have Anna behind the scenes. I don't know if you want to jump on and say hi, Anna. Maybe not. That's fine. This session will be recorded. Use the chat window for questions. My moderators will be fielding those. They will be happy to step in, jump on the mic, and let me know if there's a question I need to stop and answer. I do not mind that at all. We do want to go through the code of conduct. It's very, very important. We take this very seriously. This event is for you to learn and to have some fun and get some information, network with some other people. Basically, we're going to paste this into the chat. You can read through it. I'm not going to read it text by text because you can see it, but be cool, be friendly, be kind, be empathetic, and let's have some fun. That's the goal for today. So to get started, we're going to jump into the module now. Again, that's aka.ms learn Blazor. Let me pop over here. So this is the module. What we're going to do is set up your environment so that you can build your first Blazor WebAssembly app if you haven't already. I know it's a exciting technology, so a lot of people probably jumped out and have experimented with it. We're going to create a project and we're going to add some client-side logic. Like I said, I'll be answering your questions throughout, and if we have time afterwards, we'll explore some more advanced projects with it. So I'm going to go ahead and click Start. This is actually one of the modules I haven't completed under this profile. So what is Blazor? Blazor is the culmination of a dream that I believe began years and years ago. And this was this dream for .NET developers to be able to write code that runs everywhere. Write C# .NET code that runs mobile, browser, desktop, client, gaming device, edge device, etc. This is really the dream come to reality for that browser piece of that. We've made attempts in the past. We're not going to dwell on those too much, but this is pretty powerful when I talk to you about what Blazor WebAssembly is built on. So again, we're just recapping: configure your local environment, create a new project, add a Razor page. I'll explain what Razor pages are if you're not familiar with that. And then we'll add that client-side logic. So let's talk about what Blazor WebAssembly is. Think of it as, and when I say think of it, this is really what it is. It's .NET running in your browser. But the important aspect of that is it is .NET running in your browser without a plugin. And that's because it's built on a technology called WebAssembly. Now, I know the Learn module starts with what is Blazor, which makes sense. It's a Blazor module, and then says what is WebAssembly. But I prefer to start at the bottom of the stack and work up. So let's talk about WebAssembly for a second. JavaScript has become the language that powers the web. And if you're like me and many other C# developers, it's not that JavaScript's a bad language. There's developers that love JavaScript and build production applications with it, but it can be frustrating to switch between a strongly typed, rich ecosystem like C# on .NET to something in the web. The browser also struggles with JavaScript a little bit because it is a scripted language, and the dynamic nature means it's very tough for engines to optimize. There's a lot of code put into browser engines today to optimize and make sure that JavaScript runs quickly. But because of some shortcomings, there's been an evolution over the past few years. And one of those evolutions is WebAssembly. Think of WebAssembly as a virtual machine that runs in your browser. It's not something you have to install. All of the modern browsers support it. We'll show you that list in a minute. But the idea is it's a stack-based virtual machine. Unlike JavaScript, which is a scripted, interpreted language, with WebAssembly, you have actual bytes of code that get loaded into the browser and executed. It's strongly typed, so we don't have an issue with every number being represented as a floating point. We can have ints of different sizes or decimals, etc. We can basically use any of the types that we have in C#. Now, what's interesting is some people immediately go, wait a second, I don't want a VM running inside of my browser. That is too risky. The nice thing about WebAssembly is it is a black box. In other words, WebAssembly by itself cannot do anything to your browser. It can't cause an alert box to pop up. It can't modify the document object model. It can only run its code. If you're familiar with projects like Node or doing some front-end development, you're probably familiar with the idea of imports and exports. And the idea is that WebAssembly can specify that here's a method you can call externally. JavaScript can also say, here's a method WebAssembly can call into. And so you create that glue, but that glue is inside the browser sandbox. So I cannot, for example, in a WebAssembly app, open the local file system, browse to your credential store, and pull information off. I can only do what's allowed in the browser. That is WebAssembly. On top of WebAssembly, we've built .NET Runtime running inside of WebAssembly, which would be pretty boring by itself because there would be no input, no output. And so on top of that, we have Blazor. Blazor bridges that gap between WebAssembly, the .NET Runtime, and the browser, but then it provides a ton of features and functionality to allow you to build web-based application experiences. It allows you to build single-page applications using C# and using Razor templates, which is a pretty widely adopted technology that many developers should already be familiar with. And we're going to walk through and see what that looks like as well. So I think I've done a decent job of summarizing what's on this. I'm going to give you a visual in a second, but the browsers that we have currently supported, and this has been, WebAssembly has been in a release mode for several years now. And all of these browsers support it both on desktop, tablet, and mobile. So Blazor is a type of application that you can use to run on mobile phones. So that's Microsoft Edge, Firefox, Chrome, and Safari. Let's pop back over to our slide deck here. Almost there. All right, oh, okay, there we go. All right, so this is the layer cake I just described. To illustrate what I just talked about, this is WebAssembly. This is what's inside your browser. This is the .NET Runtime on WebAssembly. This is Blazor, and together they make that complete experience. So if you're a visual type person, hopefully that helped. So let's talk about configuring your development environment. You can certainly use Visual Studio if you want to for Blazor applications. I do a lot of development with that. You can also use Visual Studio Code. The reason why I'm going to use Code for this presentation, why it's in this module, is because Code is cross-platform. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux, so no one's left out. I've got the Code website open here, and this is by and far a very loved editing tool that supports myriad languages, everything from C# to JavaScript to TypeScript to Rust to Go to even WebAssembly. You can do raw WebAssembly development in Code. It's a very extensible platform. There are a lot of helpers and extensions. And what I love about the way Code is built is it's very discoverable. A lot of times you might find yourself opening a project and Code will nudge you a little bit and tell you, hey, this project might go a little bit better for you if you install this extension. So there's plenty of extensions, and we're going to look at actually some prerequisites with that. And then there's some background platform information. So we need .NET Core 3.1. That's the latest stable version of .NET Core. I've got the page right here, .NETMicrosoft.com, download .NET Core 3.1. It'll give you instructions for different platforms. So you'll want to have that downloaded and installed. And then the last piece is some Visual Studio Code extensions. So I've got Visual Studio Code open, and it's pretty straightforward. So if you look in this upper right-hand corner, right here, this is where I deal with files, and I don't have anything open right now, so we're not going to do much here. This is obviously search functionality. There's full source control integration. There's a debugger, we've got this remote explorer, and then we've got the extensions. When I click on these, it's going to quickly tell me the extensions I've installed. So I've gone ahead and installed the prerequisites for this module. I've got C# for Visual Studio Code. What I like about this is, let's say I decide I want to experiment with Go. I can type Go, and this is going to go and find all of those extensions. When you highlight an extension, it's going to give you the ability to install it. So if you don't have this installed yet, this button will be a different color and it'll give you the install option. You can see the rating, and you can see information, contributions, etc., all of that information. So I've got C#, JavaScript debugger, and then this remote WSL is a distraction. Don't worry about installing that. If you have the Windows subsystem for Linux installed, it's going to go ahead and prompt you to install that. So that's the Visual Studio Code. I'm going to close out this copy so I don't get too confused by too many editor windows open. This will walk you through it. Now it's time to make our first app. So before I jump into it, I just want to pause and check to see if there's any questions I should answer before I move to the next step. Anyone?
There are lots of great questions going on. You won't be surprised to hear that your talented team of moderators are jumping on them.
Okay.
Lots of interesting things like MAUI, how to deploy mobile applications. Is it possible to use a Blazor application to deploy a local install on a mobile device?
Wow. Is it? That's a good question. So I would go down the progressive web app route for that, but it sounds like some people are already building their production Blazor app. So that's awesome. I'll circle back to those getting started with that, and then we'll dive into a few more of those. But those sound like some great questions going on. And thank you once again, moderators, for staying busy answering those questions. I appreciate that. To create our new Blazor WebAssembly app, I'm going to pop open into my favorite terminal that went into release over build. This is Windows Terminal. I happen to use something called Git Bash. That's my favorite command line tool. You can certainly open up another one of these. I've got multiple shells configured here. I've got a regular command line, a PowerShell, etc. So most of these will work. So don't be thrown off by the fact that my terminal might look a little bit different than yours. So what I'm going to do is just follow exactly what's here and run this .NET new Blazor WASM -o CI calc. Now I'm going to show you a little trick if you're not familiar with this. If you do .NET new and nothing else, this is going to give me a list of all the templates that are installed on my system. So these are all the ways that I can get started building a web application. We're going to do a Blazor WebAssembly app. And so we want this Blazor WASM. So what we'll do is let me clear the screen. We'll bring us back up to the top. We're going to do .NET new Blazor WASM. And then if I just did this, it would create it in the current directory. I want to create a new directory, and we're going to call that CI calc. So we'll hit enter. This is going to make that directory. It's going to install the assets that are needed for the application. And when I see it going a little slow like this, I just move my mouse clockwise. That's another trick that you may not have known. And this always speeds things up. See, it's ready to go. So we installed it. Now it's saying navigate to it and run the application. So already we can get started with our first Blazor app. So I'm going to change into that directory, and I'm just going to type .NET run. So that will spin up the application for me. It's going to restore any package dependencies that I have. It's going to compile the application. It's going to spin up a lightweight web server. And now it's listening, and we can see we've got this localhost 5001. So let's come back over to our web browser, and let's go to localhost 5001. And we get a nice loading indicator, and boom, we're in our Blazor app. Now, if we look at this application, we can see that we've got kind of a brief survey that'll take us out for using that. We've got some navigation here. Notice how it highlights when I move over. So there's styling already built in. Homepage is highlighted. I can go to counter like this, and there's no round trip, and I'm going to show you the networking in a second. And I can do this fetch data, and it's going to grab a little bit of data. The counter clicks, 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 clicks. So let's do this. Let's go home and open up our developer tools. Now notice this says 4 megabytes of resources. Some people might start sweating a little bit, thinking about a web app. 4 megabytes is huge. Well, this is a very lightweight, unoptimized version of the application for a development lifecycle. When you publish for release, it will link and do tree shaking. So it's basically going to parse the projects that you have dependencies on, remove things that you're not using, and create a very lightweight, substantially smaller payload. So we're going to go to this network tab. I'm going to make sure my cache is disabled. I just want to show you what happens when I load this. So what you can see is it hits localhost. You can see some ordinary things that you would expect to see in a web browser, some JavaScript, some CSS. We have this JSON, this JS file, and then we get these 8 requests that are pulled in. Now, keep an eye on the network. I'm going to go ahead and clear it so we can see any new activity. I'm going to go to counter, and you can see there was no refresh whatsoever. This is truly a single page app, as opposed to if I force the navigation here, then you can see I'm reloading the application. If I go to fetch data, that is actually fetching this data, and we can look at the response and we can see that we have this data payload that's being rendered. So all of that comes in that out of the box template that we just built. So I'll just keep this here. Let's go home. Let me pop back over here, close that out, and come back over here. So stop the app. Did I stop the app? I stopped the app. Yes, we're good to go. All right, that's one more down, moving right along. Now we're going to look at the structure of how Blazor is organized and talk about how it gets started and what Razor is, because Razor is your major point of extensibility for Blazor WebAssembly, and I'll show you what I mean. So this is a markup syntax for writing UI components. It's based on ASP.NET, and this is what I love about Blazor. There's so much code that can be shared across projects. This is going to tell you that most files are Razor files. We're going to take a look at that, and then we're going to check our knowledge. But let's go ahead and dive into this application. Now there's there's probably 15 ways that you can open up the application you just created. One of them is launch Visual Studio Code, navigate to the folder, open the folder, browse the code. My favorite way to do it is I'm already inside the directory, the top level directory of my project. So all I'm going to do is code and a dot for the current directory. And if all goes well, that should open up code within that project directory. So now we've got our project, and everything starts with this program here. Let me do a little bit of a zoom for you. Okay, let's shorten this window up. So this is the main program. You can see this should look familiar if you're used to building .NET Core applications. This is a main task. But then we use this special WebAssembly host builder. And within that host builder, it creates these root components. And we'll talk a little bit more about this app in a second. It does some fun dependency injection, which is always fun in an entry-level module. Of course, you don't have to. And actually, I just saw a notification down here. Required assets to build and debug are missing. Would you like to add it? So if I click yes, this is going to automatically drop a VS Code subdirectory, and it's going to contain configuration so I can debug directly from Visual Studio Code. So we can come back and look at that experience in a minute, but let's continue exploring. So we set this. The main thing that it's doing here is it's using dependency injection to configure an HTTP client. Now, why would it do that? What I love about Blazor is if you've done any type of JavaScript front-end development, you've probably had to use either fetch or XM, HTML, HTTP, XYZ, QR, PQ, or some Angular controller React component to communicate with the server. If you're a .NET developer, you're used to HTTP client, and that same client can be used in Blazor WebAssembly, to communicate with the server. This is just setting it up. So it has a base address based on the site it's being hosted from, which makes it really easy to hit local endpoints. If we look inside of these pages, you'll see this fetch data, and I'm going to go there in a second. But I want to walk through kind of the app at a high level. So this app.razor is what hosts everything. And Blazor is a bunch of stacked controls, and those controls work together. So for example, one control is this router control. And this is what's taking /counter, /home, /whatever, and I can put additional parameters and deciding which page to render based on that route. Now you can see inside of this, there's a found control, and it's using the route data and showing this default layout. And there's a not found that says, sorry, there's nothing at this address. So if we run it and we navigate to a route that doesn't exist, it's going to give us a nice message. This imports makes it very easy for me to reference components and utilities because this is a global using. So if I put something here, then it's pretty much accessible throughout my application. This is another Razor component. We can see there's HTML markup, and remember when we saw that survey prompt, we basically saw, please take our survey, here's an anchor tag, this is a link for the survey, and tell us what you think. And this gets past the title. You can have properties on these components. So think of them just like if you came from a WPF background, or if you've built anything that has markup and code behind. This code goes with this survey prompt, and so we've got this property. By setting it as a parameter, I can pass something into it. So on my main page, I'm passing in how is Blazor working for you, and I can say how is Blazor working for you, comma MS build attendees, and we'll do an exclamation mark because we're so excited about it. So I'm going to save that. Now notice that I jumped into this index. This is just another Razor template. The only thing that makes this different from those shared templates that I showed is that it has this at page directive. That is a route. So this is saying basically if you're at the root, show this, as opposed to the counter has the route of /counter. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we're going to talk about everything else that's going on in a minute. So I'm going to stop there, but you can see these pages work together with this layout and this program to kick it off. So it's a relatively straightforward project setup. Now, based on what I just showed you, we've got this great quiz to take, and this will give you points and scores and experience, and it's pretty exciting. So I don't want you to miss this. First, Blazor WebAssembly apps are powered by which runtime? The runtime provided by the browser, the .NET runtime deployed with your web app, the JavaScript runtime deployed with your web app. Oh, this is so tough. Blazor WebAssembly apps. Isn't the .NET runtime deployed to run on WebAssembly in the browser? Let's try that one. We'll see. And then how is Blazor WebAssembly UI defined? We should know by now it's Razor pages. I know some of you want it to be XAML. I understand that, but we're using Razor pages. Let's check them. Oh, yes! And we get 400 experience points. So exciting. Let's continue on. Now we're going to add our own component. So it's telling me to open Visual Studio Code. I cheated. I'm an overachiever. I went ahead and opened it anyway. We're going to create a new page for our calculator. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to come into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the pages and use this new file icon. And we're going to call it compoundinterest.razor. So now we've got a clean slate to build a new Razor component. Next thing it says is give it a page directive. So remember, this tells us how we route to the page. So I want to get to this page. How do I get there? I get there with /compoundinterest. Okay. Then it's asking me to add a header. So we'll go ahead and grab this header and paste that in so we know where we're at. Now it's telling me to go into the navigation menu and add this chunk of code. Now notice that this is using Nav Link instead of an anchor tag. And I'll explain why in a second. If we come back over to here, we can go into Nav menu. I think this is pretty important, so I'm going to actually put it right after the home page. And then what is it? Shift-Alt-F to format document. And if it doesn't, that's fine. So the Nav Link is that special link that does the highlighting for you. If you use an anchor tag, you can click, you can go somewhere. With the Nav Link, it's going to do the automatic highlighting for me, which is useful. Okay, optional, run the application. Let's go ahead and run it. So I'm going to go .NET Run once again. We'll let that compile some of the new components and templates that we've added. And again, this may need, oh wow, it came back faster than I thought. So I'm going to just refresh this. And now notice my update is here, MS Build attendees. And we've got this new route. Now, if I put a bad route, and I'm just going to say bad route, then I get, sorry, there's nothing at this address. So that was that main application component. If we go to compound interest, boom, we've created a new page and we've routed to the page. Right now, it's a little bit boring. It's not really doing much for us. So let's go ahead and shut down the application and see what we can do about that. So we're going to come back here. Now it's telling me to specify a table. I know that all the cool new web developers use divs and cards and everything else, but sometimes a good old-fashioned table is all it takes to lay out the formatting. So we're going to roll with that and come back to our compound interest and paste this table in. Boom. Table's pasted. Now we want a button. So we're going to throw the button in. And this time, instead of running it from the shell, I want to show you another trick from Visual Studio Code. And that is that I can do Control backtick and open a terminal right inside of code. And I can pick what my default shell is right here. This will do a new terminal. This will give me an option to select a different shell, but it automatically opens it up right inside the directory that I'm working in. So that's convenient. And then I can do .NET Run from there. And without leaving Visual Studio Code, I've got that up and running. Now we'll come back here and refresh. And we get the same thing because I probably forgot to save my file. So let's save that. Then I need to recycle the server. Wrong environment. Let's go back here. So let's Control C, up arrow to get the previous command. Spin it up again. Dun, dun, dun. And look at this. We've got some nice headings, but again, not really doing much here. So let's stop this. Back here, and I'm just gonna pause while I jump into data binding and see if there's anything relevant to anything we've covered yet, or if we're saving really cool questions for after we've walked through the module. Anything I should address right now?
Wow, there are a ton of questions coming in. I think Dan and I are kind of keeping up with them. Dan, are there any you want to highlight?
The one sort of stumbling block that I've seen a few people hit is they're having trouble getting the Blazor WebAssembly template to show up. I suspect that what's happening is that they don't have the correct SDK version as their active SDK. You need version 3.1.300 of the .NET Core SDK, which the instructions tell you how to download and install. But if you're one of those eager beavers that has been trying out the .NET 5 previews, that may cause you some problems because .NET 5 doesn't yet contain Blazor WebAssembly, and .NET 5 will become your active SDK if you have it installed, even if you installed 3.1.300, because .NET 5 is a newer version. So you might need to uninstall .NET 5 to go through this tutorial. That's one thing I've seen some people stumble on. Yeah, running .NET -- version like Jeremy's showing is a great way to check what your active SDK version is. You could also pin your SDK version using a global JSON file to 31300. That should work as well.
Yep, and I was just going to show that. So if I'm at my root level directory and I do .NET version, you can see I'm on preview 3, which means I'm actually a little bit behind because we released preview 4. And if I were to .NET new with a template here, I'd be in a completely different world. So what I did is in my temp directory, you can put this at the root of any directory. I created a file called global.json. Cat is just dumping the contents. If you're using a regular command prompt, it would be type, and I'm not even sure what PowerShell does, but if I look inside of it, it's a really simple JSON file that has SDK, and then within SDK I have this version 31300. By doing that, anything I now do from this root going down is going to use this version of the SDK, which will get us the templates that we're looking for. So hopefully that can help some people out if you have multiple versions on your system. Good one. Anything else before we jump into data binding?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think we can jump right in.
Sounds good. So few notes here. Code behind. This is something people have talked about for many years. Why mix UI and code? You can absolutely separate your code into code behind files. You can use different patterns. One nice thing about Blazor is Blazor's not opinionated about the pattern. So if you're someone who says MVVM, too much overhead, why bother? You don't have to use MVVM, but it does support it. So you can do that. We're going to do C# inline in the components. It keeps this easy and clean. I can show you some examples with the code separated out in a little bit. But basically, the code in the file creates a class that has UI that's rendered and behavior. So inside of that file, we have these things called Razor directives. Razor directives have an @ symbol in front of them, and they tell the template renderer to do certain things. Some of those are applicable to the UI, some of those are applicable to the component. For example, if you're using dependency injection and you need to grab something you have a dependency on, you can inject that using the @inject attribute. We showed you how we set up a route using the @page directive. We can also run expressions in code. Now, data binding is something that I have loved since I first started working with it over a decade ago. And one of the reasons why I went from being a Silverlight developer to an Angular developer was because Angular used a data binding paradigm. And that's why I'm back with Blazor, because data binding makes the code experience so easy. So Razor by itself enables data binding in a very straightforward way. There's a special type of markup that you use for that. And I'm going to jump into this data binding and events, but I just want to show you an example of what I just mentioned. If we look at this fetch data component, it uses the HTTP client. We'll zoom in here so you can see that. It's using inject, HTTP client, and this is what we're calling it, is HTTP. So this is the type we want. This is what the property on the component is going to be. That HTTP client that I showed you configured in the program.cs is going to be brought into here. And then notice this is a directive. So this is saying what you're going to see here is not HTML markup, it's a Razor directive. This one happens to be an if condition. So if this value, is null, then show loading. Otherwise, render this table. You can see this for each, so we have multiple forecasts, so it's iterating through those multiple forecasts. Here's the property of the forecasts. Here's the code that uses that HTTP to get the JSON. Now, what's important to note here is notice that there's no special trigger. I just call the code. Blazor is smart enough to understand when this is done, this is changed, this depends on forecasts, so it's going to reevaluate this, this will disappear, and this table will render. It's really that simple. So based on that, knowing how that existing piece of functionality works, we can start to add some data binding and events to our page. So what I'm going to do is copy this to add a code markup, and I feel a little silly copying that because I probably could have typed it just as fast, but that's okay. We're going to come down here and we're going to give a block for code. And this is code that could be pulled out to a code behind. Now we're going to populate that code with some properties. These are the values we need. What am I doing? I can just do copy. These are the values we need to do the computation. So I'm going to take this and paste that out. So we've got principal, interest rate, years, total, yada, yada. Okay, so some information there. And then we need some calculation logic. So this is where it starts to get over my head, why I'm thankful for specs and other people to tell me what algorithms to include in my code, because if you asked me on the top of my head what this formula was, I couldn't tell you, but here it is right here, principal times math to the power of 1 plus interest rate divided by 1200, years times 12, total 2 string C. So there's some formatting going here. Notice total is a string, and so we're formatting that value. So if I just did this, I could publish this and I would have a nice block of code, I'm sorry, a nice component that did nothing, because there's nothing tying this code down here to this template up here. So that's where data binding comes into play. And if you look at this, we can copy, and I'll show you what this looks like. So the first thing we're going to do is replace these rows with this. Now notice that I've got input at bind equals principal. Just using this special razor directive, it's smart enough to know that whatever I put in this input field should go to principal. Whatever I should put in years should go to years. Now it's interesting that principal is a double. It's not a string. Years is an integer. So we have even different data types here. We're not doing anything special. We're just saying at bind. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to take this button and bind it to a calculation. So we'll do this. Notice that once again we have a razor directive that says when this HTML event, this is something that happens inside your browser, when that happens, because there's an at in front of it, instead of calling JavaScript in your browser, we're going to call this method on the component. And that method is going to do this calculation. So hopefully I did all of my cutting and pasting correctly. Let's go ahead and see if .NET Run actually runs. So much anticipation. And we've got something. If it compiles, ship it, right? We're ready for production. Let's go here, and there we go. So remember, this was bound to a double. So I could say trouble and years, and notice that it didn't take it. But if I change this to 6,000, that works fine. So it's smart enough to do the value conversions. So let's say that I wanted to get a 200 square foot studio apartment in San Francisco. And so we're going to estimate about 800,000 for that. And I need a 60-year loan, but interest rates are really good. So we'll do 3 and we'll calculate that. And that's not how this works because we're not doing that. But if I had this much in an account over this many years with this rate, here we go. This is the magic number. So we have success. And I know that you probably have never been so excited to know that if you put $2 in an account for 50 years at an interest rate of 2%, that you would end up with $5.43. There's just so much you can do with this calculator. Let me close that and close that. And we'll come back. Don't look at what's on the screen. That's a secret. We'll get back to that. So this tells you to run the application, and we go to our summary. So what we did is we set everything up. We got our prerequisites installed. We built an application. We even added our own page and route. Hopefully that was pretty straightforward. Sorry, I've got a screen bouncing around over here. Okay. And we did the fundamentals. Now notice this says get more practice, build a Blazor to-do list, Blazor Pizza Store workshop. So there's some other places we can go, and I plan to go there. I'm going to show you a resource. I'm going to see if there's any questions that I can answer, and then we'll dive into some other Blazor projects so we can see just what's possible with the power of Blazor. But I do want to call out this site right here. This is github.com, Adrian Torres, Awesome Blazor. You can just search for Awesome Blazor and you will find this. This is the resource for Blazor, period. Look at this. Shout out to Microsoft Build. All right. Then we've got all of this content, whether it's blogs, sample projects with different types of projects, games, experiments, machine learning, mobile Blazor bindings, to-dos, and others. So there's a lot of information there. I'm not biased because I might have something on the list, but this is a very exciting resource to go explore. Now, having said that, we've gone through the basics. I want to jump into something a little more advanced, but first I want to pause and see if there's any questions I can answer on air.
I'm not sure, Dan. What do you think? I'm doing my. We're frantically answering all the questions we can as they come in. Any that stand out?
Let's see, there's a question about inheritance of components. Like, can you have components inherit from other components? Jeremy, do you want to take that one, or if you want, I can talk to that.
I'll let you talk to that because I've done a base component and I've done components that talk to each other, but I haven't like stacked a component from another component.
Yeah, I can talk to that briefly. So the thing to realize about components is that components are just C# classes. Like, you're writing components in these Razor files, but when you build the app, those Razor files just get turned into C# code, and they're turned into a class, and then you build the class. So most of the like Razor directives that you see in components are just impacting the C# code that gets generated from the Razor file, which then just gets compiled into a a .NET class. So you can use a particular Razor directive at inherits to say that you would like your component to derive from a particular base class. That's basically saying, when you generate this class, this is the base class I want you to use. So that's a really easy way to do it. And then you can, of course, use partial classes to extend that as well. So yeah, you can define a component-based class and reuse it in your app. If you want to see an example of inheriting from another component, just look at the layout in your application that you just made. Under the shared folder, there's a file main layout.razor. That's just a component. It happens to be a layout component, and the only thing that makes it special is that it derives from layout component base using that at inherits Razor directive. So that's an example of deriving from a component, but that base class could be any component base class that you'd like.
There's one other question I've seen repeated a few times, which is asking or pointing out that a lot of the data bindings, or that the data bindings, are strings. And is there a way to have them not be strings and have them strongly typed?
When you say a string, like what's an example? We just built this calculator. So I'm binding to a property of yours. This is HTML markup. So does someone, is it this that someone's?
I think that's the thing, yeah. Because it's the app bind, so it's binding to the Blazor components You know what I mean? The Blazor component is binding to that year's property.
Right. I mean, this is like HTML markup, right? Class equals table. So I guess I'm not clear on what.
So scroll down a little bit, Jeremy. Like show the code below. I think if you look at the what you're binding to, I can guess what people are talking about. So we do like you are binding from an input to a double. So you can bind. We do some type conversions as part of the bind. Yeah, and then the reason why total, I believe in this case, is being set as a string is just so that to enable the formatting. So I think it is doing a strongly typed bind in this case. We do have some features on the backlog that people have requested, like having support for when you do that binding for controlling the formatting. Like when you bind to this decimal, I want you to bind with this particular format string. If you do date times, we have features that already enable you to do that, but it's pretty much limited, I think, currently just to date time. People have asked for formatting for other types as well. But that's something that's on our backlog, and hopefully we'll get to that in either .NET 5 or soon thereafter.
Yep, and you know, you can certainly, if you've worked with other data binding systems, they have value converters. There's not, I don't think, a concept of a value converter, but you can easily put it off a base class or a code behind, or even inject a converter and do something as simple as if I wanted years to be a string, I can just expose public string year string, and that is years to string, and it's as simple as that. And then I bind to this and I get the string version. I can pass formatting, so it's pretty lightweight to add either properties like getters or methods on your controller to do the types of conversions you'd want to do. So that was a good question just on the data binding. The other thing to note on the data binding is that you can create expressions here. So I'm going to the calculator, but if I wanted to, I could say something like this and call this with a parameter. So I can do that, and then let's say this binding was loading something asynchronously. Then I can expose an asynchronous method and do an async await calculate async, and that will work as well. So you do have a lot of flexibility in what's inside these quotes. These quotes are just an entry point for defining the data binding. This is actually evaluated as code, not as a string. So that's why I'm getting the squigglies, because it can only be used within an async Lambda expression, which I think should have been like async like that or something similar. And then calculate async isn't really async, so we could go down and do that. But let me go ahead and close this out without making a change, and then check to see if there's something else we wanted to discuss. Otherwise, I'll show a couple other projects.
I think it's fine to show other projects, and Dan and I can go through and keep answering questions.
Okay.
I've seen a couple of people ask specifically about, like, you know, sharing libraries and like hosting the application. Like, it might be interesting to show an ASP.NET Core hosted project, just so people understand what that looks like. That how you can have code on the client and server and have a shared library. If you want to create one of those real fast, that might be interesting to some people.
I've actually, the card checker is a hosted app.
Yep. Work.
So let me run this and show this, and then let's jump into the project. So I've got card checker. Now notice that there's a solution file, so I could open this with Visual Studio. I can also run this really easily from code. What's nice about the ASP.NET Core hosted is the server takes a dependency on the client, so the server knows how to serve the client. In other words, even though the client is a set of static assets, because it's ASP.NET hosted, it's smart enough to build the client and host it. So to run it, I can just run project server, and I need to know what the server name is. So I'm going to do .NET run project server car checker server CS proj. And what this will do is it'll build the server project. Because it has the dependencies on the other projects, it's going to build them as well. And it's going to stand up a hosted. Now, the reason why you would do hosted is a few things. For example, let's say you're standing up your own authentication. You want the application to run and have most of the logic in the client, but you need an external authentication source. And in this case, it's being hosted from that ASP.NET controller. So the ASP.NET host is providing things like web APIs, it's providing things like identity services, and then that client can talk to it. And we'll look at just how it does that. Now notice it's the same localhost 5001. So let's go ahead and open that up and see what this project looks like. And I need HTTPS. All right, it's the red dot project. Apparently, I am already logged in. Let's go ahead and look at this. So this has full authentication. I can log out, I can register, I can sign in. I'm not going to go through all that because there's a lot of other things I'd like to show you. But this is a form for a license. So let's go ahead and start typing. And this is auto-completing. And we'll go ahead and pick this one and see what happens. And what we've got is an application that allows me to look up a car, buy a license tag, see a visualization of a car, and then see what issues that car might have. And we can take a photo, add the photo, etc. You can see I've got this full, graphic of the car. Let's pick a couple other ones just to see what we can get. So we have this OSA. And this one, roof. So notice as I'm clicking on parts of the car, it's letting me add notes. So I'm clicking on this front fender. I'm going to come down here, add note. Front right looks like a brush up with a brush. And I'm not going to do the photo thing because I haven't tested that, but now I've got that note. I can come off, I can come back on, etc. We can save it, and then it's actually, there's a database behind this. So let me drop out of this now. Come back here, you can see some of the behind the scenes. Let's open up this project and see what it looks like. So what we've got is the client, the server, and shared libraries. Now these shared libraries are important. I'm going to show you another project just to show you how powerful these are. So in the shared project, we've got things like just a class, damage detection result, inspection note. Notice that this one has some tags on it because this is actually using Entity Framework Core and using that for the database backend. But this same class, notice, see how this is required, and this is a range. This is another thing I love about Blazor. This same class can be shared between the client and the server. The server can use it to interact with the database and perform validation to make sure invalid data doesn't make it into your database. But without projection, without transformation, without going through a DTO and then translating it back and doing weird code sharing, the client just takes a dependency directly on that shared project. And I'm opening up the project file. So if we look at this, we can see these different includes. It's just including that same shared project. So anytime those classes change, the client's going to change as well. If we look into the server, let's go ahead and open this up. Notice that we have controllers, We've got areas with pages for identity. So this is a bunch of scaffolding that does the identity. I don't want to overcomplicate things now, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but know that when you're creating a new Blazor template, there's an option to generate it with authentication built in. That authentication can be application hosted, and if you choose application hosted, it will scaffold all of the classes, all of the code necessary to create the database for you and manage the users in a database. And I believe this one's probably using the local SQL server, but I could change my provider to something like MySQL or something else if I wanted to. There's that capability, but it does all of that for me. And I'm just gonna poke around a little bit. So we've got like this controller here. So this is standing up a web API. We're not talking about Blazor right now. We're looking at an ASP.NET web API server. It's standing up an API endpoint. And this one's just returning some random values. This is the identity server. So this is what is working with the client to log someone in. Now here's a controller that actually has a DB context. So if you're not familiar with Entity Framework, a DB context is how you define the mapping of your C# classes to your database. And think of it as the data access layer, the API for data. So I don't have to write SQL. I can take this DB context and then I can do things like run link. So right here, it's doing vehicles where last updated greater than equal to since include vnotes. So this link is saying basically use this date time to filter and bring in a related entity that's part of that. And by doing that, this will translate to an actual SQL query underneath the scenes. In fact, if we go to the program, we can see when this host service is set up, it is creating a DB context, and then it's also making sure that the database is there. So the first time you run this, it'll create the database and seed data into it. In subsequent runs, it won't do that. Now this could be pulled out to a separate step as well. So then if we look at the client, we've got this data URL. Let's see, local vehicle store. So local vehicle store is a class that this is going to use to interface with that is actually taking the HTTP client and using it to grab and synchronize with the database. So this is actually pretty cool. I'll call this out too before I show you another project. What this client is doing is this application is capable of running offline. So if it loses its connection with the server, it is using JavaScript to store edits inside the browser. So there's local browser storage that you can access through JavaScript. So this is using interoperability from Blazor to JavaScript in your browser to store that. Then it'll synchronize and read those locally stored when it has the connection. And here's the API client. Now notice I don't have an HTTPS, ABCD, port 123. I'm actually just using this endpoint because this has already been configured based on the URL it's being hosted from. So I don't have to worry about that. If I'm going to a third-party resource, I'll set that up, but this one will pull that in automatically. Notice too that it's taking a claims principal, so this is factoring in authentication. It's looking at the local signed in user and it's using that user for context. So this is a great example to look at. And if you, I believe you could just Google car checker. It's Steve Sanderson's GitHub. So it's github.com/Steve Sanderson MS, I believe, /car checker. You can grab that. I want to show you another project since we still have a little bit of time. Are there questions I need to field based on what I just walked through before I jump somewhere else?
There were a couple of questions about data binding and people expressing concern about magic strings in the data binding. I think they're referring to the string that you specify for what you're binding to, like you say at bind and then some string. People asking, like, could that be strongly typed? Or is that strongly typed?
It is strongly typed. So let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and pull up another project. Yeah, so it probably can throw someone off seeing quotes, because we've been trained as C# developers that quotes are strings or strings or strings or strings. But the reality is, I like to think of when I'm looking at a Razor template and I'm using one of those binding directives that takes a binding expression, basically, those quotes are like a hole being torn into the HTML. They really are not a magic string. They are a window into the opportunity to actually run code. And to illustrate what I mean, let me just bring this over. And let me pull up, let's find a control. Okay, so like, for example, this is a more advanced control. So this has a type param. So this is a control that's a control of type T. So if you can see, the name of this Razor template is Concurrency Field.Razor, but it's actually designed to work with any type of model, T model. So I can pass a type to it. Then I've got a parameter being passed in of a model and a database model. Notice that I'm also passing in a parameter that's a model and an icomparable for a property. And I'll show you how that's used in a second. And then I have some rules here. So inside of the data binding where this is called, if I look at this contact update, notice, like, let's take a look, for example, at this. So when I click this, I've got an asynchronous call that's awaiting cancel async. This is not a magic string. Think of this as a hole in the HTML that punches through to the code behind it. So this quote is where HTML templating stops. This is where code begins. If I come in here, and just to show that it's not a magic string, let me put an X. We'll just give it a second. And already I've got a squiggly because I don't have anything called cancel X async. It's cancel async. I also will get IntelliSense inside of this because it's not a magic string. Again, it's actual code. This is cancel async. So let's do this. If I start typing and it's running a little slow, see that? I get this auto completion IntelliSense. So I'm able to find methods on that. So just want to stress that this is definitely not a magic string. Now the reason I pulled up this project is, notice this concurrency field. The whole purpose of this is if you're editing something and you go to update it and someone else has updated it on their side, we want to give you a message and say, hey, this has changed. Are you sure you want to post your changes? What this will do is actually show you what the changes were so you can make that decision. This is a reusable control because it highlights things differently based on whether they're the same or different. So if what's been updated is different from what you've put in the form, and I'll show you an example of that, then it's going to highlight it so that it jumps out at you and you see what those changes are. This is using that concurrency field. It's passing in the model, which is a contact, the database model. So this is what I've edited locally. This is what's on the database. And then this property is an expression that tells it what property I'm looking at. So I'm actually passing in a Lambda expression saying I'm interested in looking at state. I'm interested in looking at zip code. So I can even do something that advanced as pass a Lambda expression to another control. And so if we run this, I want to point out two things, and then we're getting low on time. Let me just, let me do this one. We'll set this as startup project and start without debugging. So this is actually a reference application that I'm working on. And once we pass it through some scrutiny, make sure that we're following good practices and standards, I'll make it more generally available. But it demonstrates code reuse in Blazor applications as well as using Entity Framework Core. So the controls, like what I'm showing you, are shared between WASM, Blazor WebAssembly apps, Blazor server apps. There's a few different flavors and models of this, but it's also designed to show you sort of a comprehensive style of going through, and this is going to be a little bit slow because of everything I have going on. This is a basic grid, and this is the extent of my UI prowess, so no one's allowed to laugh or make fun of this, but I can filter on name, so I can say gold, and you can see this change. I can page through, but let's go ahead and edit this contact here, and then I'm going to just go ahead and copy this, paste this. Let's not try collections right now. Thanks for the suggestion. I'm going to paste this here, and then I'm going to change the state to Florida. So it's San Francisco, Florida. That may or may not exist. Submit that. Okay, successfully updated. Now we're in Florida. So this contact, when I opened it, it was still Hawaii. And here I want to change it to, let's say, Arizona, AZ. So I click submit, and boom. It's telling me contact details have changed, updated fields, and notice that these are all green because they're the same. And then I've got this Florida here and this Arizona. So I can choose to submit and overwrite or cancel and back out. So I'm going to submit and go back to the list, and it pops me back on the page I am. So the point of this is to show that these components can be reused not just within an application, but across applications, and even in Blazor WebAssembly apps and Blazor server apps. So there's a client here that's a WebAssembly client that uses that, and even so much as there's a repository pattern that's used the same way on the client and the server. When you're running in the client, you have to talk to the server. So that interface, that data access interface, when you say asynchronously, give me a list of contacts, in the browser, the implementation is going to call a web API and get the list of contacts back. In the server, it's just going to go directly to the database and grab that list of contacts. So we'll get that example out there for you as well. Now we are down to 3 minutes, so I'm going to stop the presentation. Well, actually, I've got a couple more things to show you here, so let me close out with these. So we saw the layer cake of Blazor, and what I did not do is give you a good explanation of server side versus client side. And basically, the client side is what we focused on today. The server side uses same Razor classes, same type of component model, but instead of running on WebAssembly in the browser, this is going to give you a thin client that renders everything on the server and uses SignalR to communicate. So that makes a much simpler architecture. I don't have to think about calling a web API, for example. I can do things locally and have them render, but it also means that I can't go offline. There's some latency in server resources, and there's even desktop applications. This is the link to the car checker GitHub repo. And there's also a workshop that gives you a full pizza storefront. So I wanted to share that link, and all of this will be available in the video as well afterwards. And you can go ahead and take your screenshots and everything else. These are the final links for this. I'm going to pause there. I think we have like 1 minute left. So I want to just thank my moderators once again. It sounds like they were hard at work taking care of your questions. I want to thank you for being a part of Build. This is an unprecedented time, and appreciate you deeply.